All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the very first inaugural maiden voyage of the eLiterate Standard of Proof webinar series. Really excited to have you here at the historic Muppet Theater. Please pardon our renovations. I've got a couple of ferns on order to spice up the stage here, but in the meantime, I've got a very special surprise for you. I want you all to look under your chairs because we have fabulous prizes for all of you. Mine's a dog. Seriously though, I'm really excited about this webinar series. The title comes from two important and related themes. The first is that educators at colleges and universities everywhere both should and can look at evidence to improve their practices for supporting student success, that we can know what works, and we can get better at that. And the second and related point is that very often in the process of doing that, we need to work with tools that are built by someone else. We need the help of our vendors. And so as you go through your procurement process to pick out tools to meet your goals, and you should always be picking out tools to meet your goals to support your students, you should be mindful and aware of the kind of support that you're looking for and the kinds of questions that a vendor ought to be able to answer for you. And so we're going to model that here in this series. I couldn't have asked for a better starting topic and starting panel to illustrate the goals of what we're trying to accomplish here. I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have today. Our panelists include Dr. Tim Renick, Senior Vice President for Student Success at Georgia State University, Dr. Lindsay Page, Associate Professor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Education, and Drew Magliozzi, co-founder of and CEO of AdmitHub. These all-star group, this is a canonical example of the kind of problem solving that we all can and should be engaged in. So again, delighted to have you all here today. Let's start out by thinking about the general proposition, standard of proof, and what that means. Tim, I'm going to ask, just before we dive into the specifics of summer melt, you know, I had the great fortune, ladies and gentlemen, of hearing Tim speak last week, and I'm gonna paraphrase the high-level message, but it was in my mind that we need to stop making excuses about not having college-ready students and start focusing on our attention on making sure we have student-ready colleges. And so, Tim, I wonder if you could just take a minute to give us a couple of fast facts about Georgia State's context and some of the big picture accomplishments that you've been able to demonstrate in terms of student success, to show that you can move the needle on this with the students that arrive at your door.
Sure, Michael. Yeah, Georgia State's at the leading edge of demographic trends really going on across the United States, but especially in the Southeast. You know, when I arrived here as a junior faculty member back in the late 1980s, it was a majority white campus. 70% of the students were white. Now we're 74% non-white. About 60% of our students are Pell eligible, so low-income students. And, you know, usually those demographic shifts would suggest a downturn in success rates, right? These are the populations that struggle the most nationally to complete college. And what we've been able to do at Georgia State, and data and evidence has been a critical part of the puzzle, is put conventional wisdom on its ear. So over the last decade, we've improved graduation rates by 23 percentage points. We've eliminated equity gaps. We've had 5 years in a row now where our African American, our Hispanic, and our low-income students are all graduating at least at the rate of the student body overall, in some cases a little higher. And we're now graduating more African Americans than any other college or university in the United States. And if I were to, attribute the turnaround to any one factor, it would start with the data and start with the evidence.
Fantastic. Okay, so Tim, we've got a clear sense of your mission. How did you get on the topic of summer melt?
Well, I've been doing this job at Georgia State, heading up all the student success programs for over a decade. When I first started in this position back in the, around 2009, 10, about 9 to 10% of our confirmed freshman class never showed up. So we had a group of students who had done everything high school, they applied to college, they got into Georgia State, they confirmed they were coming to Georgia State, in many cases coming to orientation, signing up for classes. It's just when fall classes began, they didn't show up. And every year for much of the past decade, certainly until 2016, that number was growing. So it moved from about 10% of the freshman class to over 18% of the freshman class that never showed up. And so we realized that we needed to do something about this. This group skewed predominantly low income, predominantly first generation. Most of these students were non-white, underrepresented minorities. And so what we were seeing is the beginning of achievement gaps or equity gaps before the students ever set foot on campus. We were already losing a subset of our low income first generation students.
Great. And I understand there was a little book that you might have stumbled across that helped you out.
Absolutely so. Yeah. So amidst this growing crisis where, as I say, we were reaching 18, 19% of our freshman class who just never showed up, I came across a wonderful book by Lindsay Page and Ben Castleman who cover the summer melt problem in a very personal fashion, show the human side of what that means, what are some of the origins of it. And so I assigned the book to my leadership team, a group of 12, 14 people who direct our Office of Admissions, financial aid, the registrar, and so forth, people who report up to me. And we read it and had a detailed discussion of what we might be able to do to try to deal with summer melt in a more effective fashion.
And Drew, I understand that you had a similar encounter with literature.
I did indeed. I actually first read the research paper that Lindsay and Ben published, and then subsequently read the book. And frankly, it was the inspiration for us to start the company we have today. What AdmitHub does is we build a communications platform that combines the power of behavioral science and uses artificial intelligence to scale it. And frankly, I thought, both from reading the book and from personal experience as a one-to-one tutor for several years, knowing that text message was the best way to get in touch with people, but being very frustrated having to do it manually, that we could build some technology, leveraging the cutting-edge stuff in AI to do it at an extraordinary scale. So frankly, Lindsay, we all wouldn't be here without you.
Aw, go on. I think I'll give you my dean's email address when we're done with this.
Perfect.
So I am reading the book myself right now. I highly recommend it. I'm holding it up as a visual aid because the title might be a little hard to remember. But it's fantastic. Don't look for it in the Kindle store. This is analog, and it is worth every ounce in your luggage. I promise you that. So Lindsay, why don't you tell us a little bit about what summer melt really is? Tim talked about these mysterious disappearing students. Help us solve that mystery.
Yeah, so thank you so much for teeing up my comments so well. So traditionally, the term summer melt has been used by admissions officers, enrollment counselors to describe a student who reported intentions to enroll, didn't enroll at that particular institution, but the assumption was always that, well, if the student didn't come to us, then maybe he or she just got off of a wait list and went somewhere else. So that was really what the term originally implied, or how it was originally used. And we sort of reappropriated that term instead to think about students, just as Tim described, that plan to enroll in a particular institution And when we looked at those students in, again, thinking about the data in National Student Clearinghouse data that let us understand whether students who were college intending were enrolling anywhere, what we found was that there was a large segment of students who weren't making that transition successfully to the institution that they had intended, and in fact not making that transition to any institution at all. And so summer melt in our work, we really describe the students that Tim is describing, those who plan at the time of high school graduation to make that transition to college, but for a variety of reasons don't successfully make the transition. Well, Michael, you're on mute.
Might help if I unmute myself. Can you talk a little bit more, Lindsay, about the particular barriers, why it is that students
yeah,
seem to never get where they're going?
Absolutely. So this, oh, great graphic. So the graphic that we've used to really think about this is that after students are admitted to college, there's really a maze of steps that they need to navigate in order to get all the way through to enrollment. What's also interesting about this period of summer is that it's typically a period of time when students and their families don't have a lot of access to guidance and support. So students have left their high schools. High schools are usually sort of buttoned up for the summer, and they haven't yet joined their college community, so it's not obvious to them that they could go to their college offices, even though they could go to their college offices to ask for guidance and support. What's interesting about this period of time is because there are so many different things that students need to be navigating, and it's hard for them to necessarily know where to look when, students can be unaware that there are certain tasks that they should be taking care of during the summer time. So I believe there's a little animation in this slide. If you just want to click forward one, go. If we think about the types of tasks that students need to navigate over this period of time, one thing is for sure is it's kind of the period of time where the rubber hits the road with regard to paying for college. So students may still be navigating completion of their FAFSA. They may be asked to verify information they've reported on their FAFSA. They may be trying to understand their financial aid award letter, or dealing with the fact that they have unmet financial need. So there are lots of tasks related to financing college that can be challenging for families. If you click forward one, there are a lot of other types of tasks that students need to be navigating, like submitting a housing application. That often has a financial component with paying a housing deposit, attending orientation and figuring out how to get to campus for that orientation, taking placement tests, and so forth. And the other thing that we should keep in mind, again, if you click forward one, one more, is that these are students, we're not entirely, but at least in the work that Ben Castleman and I have done so far, we've been thinking about traditionally aged college-going populations. So students who are 17, 18, 19 years old, they may be a little on the impulsive side. They're not great future planners. They may have a lot of competing priorities that they're focusing on. And so, as Drew mentioned, really taking a behavioral tact towards tackling this problem, we want to think about how to reach out to this population in a timely way and really focusing their attention where it needs to be focused most.
Just to pull out one of these examples, Tim, last week you said that the FAFSA form is basically a tax document, more or less. It's like filling out your tax return. And I know that as a young college student, I didn't fill out my FAFSA form. My father filled it out for me. And as I look at the list of these items, I don't think there was a single one that I navigated without parental help. And I had been, at least theoretically, taught to be as, taught the skills, the college-going skills that I was supposed to be taught as a middle-class college prep tracked kid. So a lot of this was invisible to me, and is likely invisible to the people who manage the process. So Tim, why don't we talk a little bit about making the invisible visible and addressing it? What tools, after speaking with Lindsay and having your staff become aware of this challenge. What tools did you decide that you need, and how did you go about figuring out how to tackle this problem?
Yeah, good questions. I mean, the first thing to say to underline what Lindsay was just talking about is we did an analysis of exactly what was happening to our students. We had never really paid attention in detail to what specific steps from a bureaucratic perspective were tripping up our students. And, you know, in many ways, it was a nightmare for a student body that is mostly low income, mostly first generation. You have, you know, students being raised by their grandmother, getting requests in the middle of July and August from the federal government for verification that the grandmother is the legal guardian and that the parents, the biological parents, are not providing financial support for that individual. And, you know, no 17, 18-year-old is probably going to respond to that effectively, but these particular 17, 18-year-olds from low-income backgrounds, these families are not going to lawyers and filling out official paperwork to move guardianship to grandma. You know, mom and dad are gone, grandma's taken over. The student gets this request from the federal government saying we want written verification, and pretty much tucks it in his pocket and says, I guess I'm not going to college because I don't have written verification. My grandma doesn't either. So what we needed to do is begin to think about ways to help the students at those pain points, those times during the summer where they're facing something very specific without the tools and the context in order to be able to navigate it. You know, we had for years been doing what every university does. We send students emails, right? We send them emails by the dozen. We can track how many of those emails get opened. And, you know, sadly, even for our incoming freshmen, only about 20% even get looked at. And even so, the emails that we send were not nuanced enough to deal with the problems that the students have. We might be sending them an email reminder to turn in your FAFSA because the deadline's coming up, but the student's problem is they've just gotten a notice saying that they need to be able to show that their grandmother is their legal guardian. So we weren't being responsive enough to the individual issues that students were facing. And at the time, this is the summer of 2016, where we were looking for better solutions, there was not any a magic system out there that we thought filled the bill. There were what are called nudging platforms. There were ways we could text students in a unidirectional sort of way. So we could send them a text to let them know a deadline was coming up or they needed to do something. But if they had a problem, if they wanted to respond, say, well, I know the deadline is next week, but here's the problem. I need to get my father to sign the form, and I haven't seen my father for the last 18 months. There was no easy way for them to voice those kind of opinions. We also had people waiting on phones, you know, to answer these questions, but a lot of the students just never called. And so we had this growing number of students who were facing challenges that in effect were surmountable. We could get them the help they need to overcome these obstacles, but we were never getting in contact with them. We were never able to address their problem in a timely fashion.
And I just want to sort of piggyback something that Tim just shared. I have seen that over and over in research that I have done with Georgia State, in other settings as well. For any institution, it is simply not sufficient to set up a passive system of advising, to say, the advising office is here and here are hours, and if you figure out what your question is, you come on in and we're going to help you with that. When we did that in the context of our experiments, we basically found that nobody came through the door, nobody called. Whereas if you prompt students through the summer to say, hey, here's the thing that you should be thinking about. Are you thinking about that? How's it going? What questions do you have? That's the kind of strategy that is going to get students through the door, that is going to surface the challenges that are actually sort of bubbling underneath the surface.
I think that's a great point, and I'll add that as we talk as a nation about equity and achievement gaps, part of the problem is right here, because the students from middle and upper income backgrounds and maybe from majority demographic groups feel more empowered to say, I demand an explanation. Students from low income first generation backgrounds are often very reluctant to push the system. So not only are we doing a poor job as universities of proactively getting them this information, but they're not the most likely students to raise their hand and say, I need help.
That's right.
So Tim, in facing this complex challenge, this sort of multi-headed challenge, you made two decisions. You decided to contract with a vendor, and you decided to engage in a study about the impact of your intervention. Can you talk to me a little bit about those two decisions and how they related to each other?
Yeah, like a lot of universities, when we go about looking for a technology partner, we do a search. You know, we look at what's out there, the features that the different vendors offer, and so forth. And at the time, this is now talking about early 2016, most of the tech companies that were offering help with communicating with incoming student populations had what I was describing as a nudging system, a unidirectional texting platform that would allow the university to nudge the students, but not provide the students with any ability to respond back again. So we had a very targeted search. What we were looking for in a technology partner was a company that could help us overcome that limit and allow the students to get back to us with any questions or follow-ups or problems they had. And so that was a critical component of what we needed to do. Now, why we decided to go with a random control trial and basically work with Drew and Lindsay on doing a controlled study is really quite practical. You know, any of these changes at a university are hard to enact. Institutions tend to be very set in their ways. There are a lot of very smart people who think that they know best how to deal with a myriad of issues, faculty and staff who are often, you know, highly degreed. And so what we've done at Georgia State consistently is try to find from the very beginning of new initiatives, the data to track, to support, and ultimately to confirm the usefulness of whatever intervention we have in place. There are not many languages that unite all the faculty at a big comprehensive university like Georgia State. I mean, we have faculty in neuroscience and we have faculty in studio art. But one thing all the faculty are trained to do is respect the evidence. They've all gone through graduate programs and they have, you know, this kind of training as their background. So we find it very helpful to the first time we're trying to launch something, often before we're able to fully scale it, use that moment in order to create a controlled trial where we have a treatment group and a control group, students who are getting the new initiative and those who perhaps are not yet, and being able to use that moment in order to track comparative data.
Drew and Lindsay, I want to talk to each of you about that a little bit in turn. Drew, I speak to a lot of small companies preaching the gospel of getting involved in the kind of research work that Tim was just describing. And very often I hear, well, we'd love to, but it's you know, we're small. We're just trying to pay our salaries right now. And, you know, this is something we'll have to get to later. But I understand that you were looking for an opportunity like this really early on. Why?
Well, first, thank you for asking. First, probably out of necessity. I think there are two reasons personally why I like to follow the data. One is that I'm a mediocre salesperson. So I couldn't, frankly, in good faith, tell somebody it's going to work if I didn't believe it myself, and I have a pretty high threshold for believing it. I think even our pitch to Tim and Scott Burke over at Georgia State was, it might work, we hope. And luckily they were believers, and we had Lindsay on the conference call as well. But also the second one is I didn't want to waste my time doing something that was ineffective. Frankly, I think the worst outcome of all would have been something that I wasted years of my life pursuing, which frankly did no good, maybe did some harm, or no harm at all, but frankly was a net neutral. I don't think that would be a very good way to spend a life. I will also say that if RCT with your very first partner is a great recipe for sleepless nights and gray hair. I got a little like patch, I don't know if you can see it on my chin, thanks to that RCT, because I saw all the warts and hiccups. And I think even Lindsay, if memory serves, the hypothesis was that after we launched, I think we launched about 8 weeks later than we expected, you kindly told me that you didn't think it was going to work. Maybe that was just for my expectations. But lo and behold, it did, which is why we're all here, I suppose. But frankly, I wouldn't have done it any other way if I had it to do over again. Even without knowing the outcome, I would do the same thing. And frankly, also, it's good to note we've continued the commitment. It would be easy to say one RCT and done, but we've done 8 more, which have consistently shown impact in similar settings on similar problems, or even very diverse settings and even very diverse problems. So it's frankly a core part of the DNA of who I am, and I think what the company stands for.
I think the other thing that I would just add is, you know, having the research component was really important for me in getting involved. And I think it was brave, both of Georgia State, it was brave of AdmitHub to do that. But I think that there is such an opportunity to sort of contribute to the broader understanding of how should universities be changing their practice in order to be more student focused.
Folks, I want to emphasize what you just heard. I mean, randomized controlled trial is one way to do research. There are multiple ways to do research. It happens to be a particularly rigorous and in some ways painful
No.
approach. Okay.
It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. You have to take that back. It does not have to be painful. It also does not have to be expensive. There are graduate students all over this country who are hungry for meaningful research to do. And so I think that there's also an opportunity to leverage that underutilized resource in order to test the things that we're trying.
Thank you, Lindsay. I do take it back, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to amplify on that later.
Okay.
Because it's a really important point. What I was getting to here is that here's a very small, very new company when it starts out that does a randomized controlled trials. And Drew, did I hear the count correctly? Did you say 9 randomized controlled trials? Okay.
Yeah, not all of them are complete yet, but we've got 9 either in flight or completed.
So folks, look, you know, these companies on the one hand, they need your help because they can't do the research in absent of a collaborating university, right? So some of this is on all of you in the audience, but at the same time, you know, you should not accept from a vendor that they just can't do the research, because it can be done, it should be done. We have a collective responsibility to do it. So Lindsay, I want to pivot to you, because very often I know that folks in your position are out doing good work, writing books, once again, on Amazon.
Just in time for the holidays.
Just in time, exactly. Buy one, you know, it's a great stocking stuffer. But very often the incentive on the one hand in the research community is to move on to the next study. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, you don't get the kind of institutional engagement that you got from Georgia State saying, okay, how do we put this into action and actually help students? So could you talk a little bit about that experience working with Georgia State and AdmitHub, and also any advice that you have for our audience about thinking about engaging, bridging the gap between good research and putting that research into practice in a way that really helps students?
Yeah. So in terms of lessons for practice in engaging with researchers, I think one of the key lessons is researchers are your friends, and you should have your research partners at the table from the get-go. That part of the plan for implementation should at the same time be the plan for research, because the research and the implementation plan should go hand in hand. It is much harder for a researcher to be brought in after the fact, and you know, for the technology partner, for the institution doing the implementing, for them to have done something and then come to the researcher and say, tell us if it worked or not. because that's going to lead to sort of reconstruction of the truth, reconstruction of what happened, and a much less credible research design. I will say that bringing a strong research design to the table, I guess, you know, in this case, we did find positive effects, and I imagine that also was a key part to subsequent fundraising on the work, so that it would be possible to go from this study on summer melt to then asking questions about, okay, how can this tool be leveraged to support students in other time points in their educational journey?
Yeah, and maybe I should speak to that, because any of the listeners who are from university perspective, I think that we have an obligation to try to support this kind of research. And it's self-interested as well, as Lindsay is suggesting, that, you know, you think about this, we were launching something that was very, very new, trying to deal with summer melt via an AI-enhanced chatbot. We didn't know, as Drew pointed out, whether this would work or not, although we strongly thought it had a good chance of working. But because of Lindsay's research, you know, 6 months after we concluded that first summer, you know, she was publishing and sharing RCT quality data, I guess initially Journal of Social Science Research, and then later it was republished, or some of the work was revisited in the Harvard Business Review. There couldn't be anything more valuable to me on campus and trying to convince my stakeholders to support this, including the president, the chief financial officer, and so forth, than saying, look, we tried something, and here's the confirmed data for the impact it has. And oh, by the way, it's not only working from a student success perspective, it's bringing additional revenues into the university, because each of those students who was walking away in the past is now enrolled, paying tuition and fees. You know, this is really critical. And as Lindsay was hinting at, this allowed us a few months later to go to some national foundations, Dell Foundation, ECMC, to get additional support for the next iteration of the work we were doing with chatbots, and ultimately work with partners in the University Innovation Alliance to spread this work to other large public universities. So it's not like we were doing this by some, you know, in some sacrifice. This was really something that served our interests very strongly and made it possible for us to greatly expand the program.
I'm tempted to take a little diversion into the value of such experiments that produce quote unquote failures, because we do learn a lot, even when, particularly sometimes when what we think will work turns out that it doesn't work. But you struck gold on the first time, so and we only have 30 minutes left, and we need to explain everything there is to understand about artificial intelligence. So I think we're going to move on. So Drew, let's turn to that topic. I have probably 9 times out of 10 when I write about AI in eLiterate, it's in a post that is heaped with scorn and snark. And it's not because I think
appropriately so.
It's not because I think that that these data science techniques have no value in education. To the contrary, I've also written long posts trying to explain really obscure and maybe to some people boring topics about how these are useful, but it's really because sometimes those 2 letters, AI, or their just ever so slightly pompous cousins, machine learning, can be used as a kind of razzle-dazzle to try to convince educators at institutions that really this is way too complicated for them to understand, and they should just take our word that it works. After all, they only have, you know, some of them only have PhDs. So could you tell us, so we have the situation, we have a chatbot. I think most people understand what it looks like. There's a conversational interface. You know, you can think of it without AI as a kind of automated FAQ. And maybe if it's a sophisticated automated FAQ, it'll have a little bit of branching in it. But for a long time, chatbots were kind of stuck there. So could you help us understand what is AI and how does it help with this problem?
Sure thing, Michael. And I'll make it quick. It'll be like a bee sting. No one will be hurt too badly from this little diatribe.
And we have a smiley face Band-Aid afterward.
Yes. Before I begin, I think the most important thing to note is that AI is an incredibly powerful technology, and specifically machine learning as a subset, that really is not a point solution. Frankly, for it to be used most effectively, it needs to be woven into the fabric of the core strategy of an institution. And I honestly think, not to gloss over this fact, the most important aspect of our partnership was that, frankly, Tim, you invited us in. And you invited us in to show us all that was working and not working and what needed to be done to help ameliorate the problem. That was, frankly, the most important aspect of what we ended up doing together. In any event, I've got 4 quick slides that will talk to everyone about this, what exactly AI is. So frankly, this is an animated image of a Turing machine, also known as the digital computer. And it was designed to solve any problem or perform any task for which a program could be written. It was actually invented by Alan Turing, played here by Benedict Cumberbatch, to crack the German code during World War II. And it also initiated essentially the age of artificial intelligence. This was in the 1940s. In essence, you could say all computers are AI in one form or another. But frankly, it's breakthroughs in machine learning that you talked about, Michael, specifically a thing called deep learning with convolutional neural networks that have brought huge advances to the field lately. But before we get into the geekery of the technology, let's talk for a quick second about one aspect of human intelligence. Frankly, that's prediction. Prediction is the primary function of the neocortex, which makes the part of our brain, the frontal lobe of our brain, uniquely human. And actually, this framework is taken from a book titled Prediction Machines, to plug yet another one for your stockings this holiday season, which is a very accessible read. But essentially, prediction is using information that you do have to generate information that you don't have. And frankly, while prediction is essential for decision making, it is not a decision. And a great illustration of this, appropriate today, given a 70% chance of rain this afternoon by the weather person, that's a prediction. The decision is whether or not I'm going to bring an umbrella to work and risk losing it on the subway. And so frankly, AI is already making predictions more accurately and abundantly than ever before. You notice the weather person is not wrong any longer. And recommendations and predictions all over the internet are becoming more accurate and personalized. But frankly, the decisions we make with that information are the key to the success with this technology. Meaning, frankly, AI, again, has to be core to the most strategic decisions you're making to get the greatest value out of it. So I'll talk really briefly now about the specific flavor of AI that we use, which is called natural language processing. And the prediction we make is trying to predict the meaning of language with a neural network and trying to represent it as a number. In essence, we're turning words into numbers. And here's a brief representation about how one word might have high rankings like king on masculinity and royalty, but low on femininity, and queen might have similarly high rankings on royalty, but low on masculinity, yet high on femininity. And the idea here is that you're able to do astoundingly complex mathematical computation with language, essentially to help remind you of all your undergraduate or AP physics courses. What we are doing when language meets mathematics is we are turning words into numbers and manipulating that language with mathematics to understand what it means. Watsky, can you do the next slide? So in this next slide, what we have is representing these numbers that I had in the previous slide graphically. You can say something like king minus man plus woman, and you'll get the output for queen. We can also understand synonyms for things. Someone might ask, who is the queen? And we would know that question. And then without specifically training the system, you could say, who's the female monarch? And we can also understand it. And frankly, this was super helpful in the issues that we face, obviously with students enrolling, where they asked tons and tons of questions, but no two students asked the same question the same way. In fact, oftentimes they would say things that were completely foreign. No one ever asked, what is the process by which I submit my financial aid documentation? They would say things like, I have no money. And we had to be smart enough to be able to give them the right answer to that particular question or statement without having to explicitly train the system every time, otherwise we would have been terribly inaccurate. So that's my quick bee sting on how this particular brand of AI works and AI in general. And the mantra I always say is, frankly, again, you need to make it part of your core strategy, and you should hail it, because I hail from Massachusetts, take the mentality, ask not what AI can do for you, but what you and AI can do together. That is the guiding principle I like to suggest folks take with this technology, whether it's working with us or anyone else.
Okay. So a couple of points on questions and answers. First of all, Q&A is open. More generally speaking, Kelvin, I see you. I promise I will get to your question before the end of the webinar. And so if you all have questions, I shouldn't be the only one who's allowed to ask. You should all feel free to ask your vendors when they start throwing around terms like AI, a question like I just asked. And if you don't get an answer that is as clear and as, let's just say, non-hyped as the one we got from Drew, tell them to go away.
Actually, Michael, can I also chime in with one caveat on the title of this webinar?
Yes, please.
Because I think it's titled...
Feel free to be brutal because I didn't make it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it was something like AI, the success of AI or whatever on the impact of AI on student success. And frankly, I think we played a part, but it was a pretty small part. Frankly, all the impact was made by the folks at Georgia State, the resources that they had available to them, and the steps that they had taken to break down barriers. The role we played was getting people to those resources, into the thresholds of those meetings. But frankly, without the extraordinary staff and resources available, our technology would have been useless. We just helped unlock the potential, I think, of the work you're already doing, Tim.
I appreciate that, Drew, but you may be a little overly modest there, because listeners should know that in the first 5 or so months we had the chatbot open at Georgia State, the system handled about 185,000 interactions with our students. And, you know, you can imagine incoming freshman class, as Drew was just saying, these freshmen are going to ask the same questions over and over again. They want money. They want to figure out, you know, the loans and how they get grants and so forth. They want to figure out how to register, how to find housing on campus and so forth. They will ask these questions hundreds of times over and in thousands of different ways. And what this system was so effective in doing is cutting through the clutter and getting the student these answers in a really efficient fashion. The average response time to a question posed via the chatbot that first summer was about 6 seconds. So instead of individual staff in our housing office or our financial aid office or our admissions office answering these questions dozens and dozens of times over, in many cases, these answers, you know, came automatically and quickly, and that freed up the time of the staff to answer the tougher questions, the questions that really do take a one-on-one, you know, person to really think through with the student. So, yeah, we needed to have the resources and the staffing in place, or none of this would have mattered. But the AI and the chatbot made the whole system work so much more effectively than we had ever been able to handle it in the past.
One other thing that I would add to that I think is really special about the implementation at Georgia State, both from a program implementation standpoint, but also from a research standpoint, is the data that it was possible to bring to bear. And so one thing that was very important about the way the outreach was done even though there were thousands of students asking the same question, not everybody who was eligible to receive every piece of outreach, it wasn't relevant for everybody. So as a very concrete example, if a student had submitted their paperwork for housing already, they didn't get any outreach related to housing paperwork because that outreach was not relevant. And so I think that kind of data integration is hugely important, because otherwise we're just going to cloud these kinds of communication channels that, at least for now, are successful. It's just going to muck those up with all sorts of communication that isn't relevant for students, and they're going to start regarding any kind of outreach as spam. So integrating the data and using the administrative data to be really targeted in outreach is one other piece that I think was really critical to the success.
Okay, so as with many of these types of solutions, this one sounds not only fantastic, but kind of obvious in retrospect. Lindsay, I'm going to give you an opportunity to make me eat a little more humble pie, explaining in prospect, how did you go about figuring out whether the intervention was working? And I want to emphasize, folks, that an experimental design is a contribution in and of itself. Learning how to properly frame a question so that you can get an answer and know if you're helping, what's helping, and how it's helping, those are really important things. So with that, Lindsay, tell us a little bit about how the magic worked.
Sure. So it's not magic. So prior to this particular project, I had done with colleagues a number of summer melt focused experiments, and the key structure of a randomized trial would be to, at the beginning of the study, at the beginning of the implementation, before you're implementing with students, identify all of those students who are eligible to receive, in this case, the summer melt outreach. And then once you have that eligible population, or that eligible sample of students, you split them into two groups, a group who are actually going to get the outreach and a group that doesn't get the outreach. And then the key is to follow both of those groups over time. In the implementation at Georgia State University with the chatbot, again, from an implementation standpoint, the next step would be to, or another step, is to map out what are all of the summer tasks that students need to be navigating. And it was by building that sort of process map that all of the language, what is the chatbot actually going to say? What is it going to reach out to students about? All of that language was constructed. Before getting started, we also wanted to specify what we hypothesized the outcomes would be in terms of what types of things what types of things would we be moving the needle on. One thing that was particularly exciting for me was that in our previous work had been more from the vantage of, say, a high school, where we were reaching out to students over the summer, but students were going to all sorts of different institutions. We could see the end result. Did they enroll where they were expected to enroll? Did they enroll anywhere? But we couldn't look at all of the process pieces in between. By working together with Georgia State University, because they were so facile with their data, we could not only look and see, did students who received this outreach enroll on time at Georgia State University in the fall, but did they have greater success with all of those process outcomes along the way? And so the answer is yes. Students were more successful in navigating all sorts of different financial aid related tasks. They were also more successful in navigating more administrative tasks, like submitting a high school transcript. And so we were able to really test the theory underlying this phenomenon of summer melt, and with the data that Georgia State was able to bring to bear, to understand that the chatbot, not only were students responding to the chatbot, but indeed the chatbot was helping students to be more successful in all of these required pre-matriculation tasks.
So it's really a peanut butter meets chocolate kind of experience here that we you'd think that we would see more often in in a situation in which the researchers and the administrators actually work at the same institution, but we don't. And I should actually qualify that and say that very often the institutions that need this help, Georgia State is an exception. It is an access-oriented research institution. But there are plenty of access-oriented institutions that do not have researchers, and researchers who do not work at access-oriented institutions. So there is, I think there's a lesson here in matchmaking that's really important.
Right. Yeah.
And I'll say quickly that, while we do have many, many able researchers at Georgia State, and we do at times work with them, there is an advantage to using an external scholar in these kind of settings, because there's going to be skepticism. If Georgia State is reporting its own wonderful innovation and the successes it's having, there's immediately, a question about that. Lindsay was able to cut through the clutter and, get her research in the Harvard Business Review, I think, in a way that probably a Georgia State researcher reporting on Georgia State results wouldn't have been able to do.
Yes, as somebody who literally co-wrote the book.
That's right.
Kelvin's asking a couple of questions that we'll get to in our very last segment of the webinar, which is about what's next. But before we do that, Scott does ask a question about if this RCT is published anywhere. The answer is yes. This webinar will be archived as a YouTube video, and I will post a link to that study in the blog post that accompanies it. But in the meantime, Lindsay, if you could give everyone the title of that study for their Google Scholar search, that would be a good helpful.
Gosh, I don't even know the title off the top of my head, but let me tell you everything I know about it. It is published. What is great is it's published in an open access journal. So there's no firewall. Everybody you print it out and put it in everybody's stocking too. So it is published in AERA Open. So AERA is the American Educational Research Association, AERA Open. We published it, I believe, in 2018, and it is written by myself and my colleague, Hunter Gelbach. So I think if you, I'll find the time to be a better representative of my own work. If you typed all of that into Google Scholar, you'd find it.
I found it.
There we go. Thank you.
No problem on Google Scholar. And you are all scholars who know how to use Google. So you should be able to find it, but I promise I'll post a link.
And Michael, let me point out quickly, because this point hasn't been made yet, that first summer we reduced summer melt at Georgia State by over 10%. Disproportionately, the benefits came to underserved populations. And since then, as we built out the chatbot over the last 3 years, it's now down by over 33%. So what was 18 to 19% rate of students melting out during the summer is now down to 12%. That translates to about 350 more students every year who are sitting in their seats ready to go when fall classes begin, who a couple years ago were sitting out college entirely.
Well, not only does that succinctly answer the slide that I believe was just up on the screen, but it's really the most powerful commercial that I think one can make. We often hear, if you hear anything at all about educational research, it's that it's a world of uncertain multiple causes and small effect sizes. So for someone to be able to report that dramatic a result, that's really deeply significant and important. That should cause you to sit up and take notice. And we should all always be tying our answers back at the end of the day, as Tim did, to number of students who are affected. It's easy to get lost in effect sizes and percentages, but at the end of the day, we're talking about humans. Mm-hmm. So given such
Can I actually ask Lindsay a question? Or
Please.
Because you talked about this so eloquently, Lindsay. You mentioned it before. Yeah, the headline of the impact is great, Michael, but actually I think it's the unspoken intermediate stuff that astounded me so much, Lindsay, which is the first time you've measured that stuff in the context of students enrolling in college, right?
Right. Yep. That's exactly right. And like I said, from a from a research standpoint, the thing that was so exciting for me was that this was really the first time that we were more directly testing the theory of what was going on with summer melt. Not that students were just changing their minds or something else, I don't know, but it was really that by being proactive in reaching out to students, being targeted with data and in targeting just the students with the communication that they needed when they needed it, we were able to improve students' outcomes. And some of the biggest process outcomes that we saw were related to all of the financial aid tasks. Students were more likely to sign their master promissory note. They were more likely to get timely access to the financial aid that they were eligible for because of this outreach.
And I think what we realized at that point, Michael, was that what we'd stumbled upon was more than a solution to summer melt, frankly. It was more of a behavior change platform, which I know we only have 3 minutes left.
Setting us up for the segue to the final segment. Go.
Yeah, it did lead us to want to do some things beyond enrollment, which means we probably have to change the name of the company at some point. But I'll let other folks talk about what came next.
Yeah, so I'll mention quickly that over the last academic year, we've expanded the use of our chatbot with the help of both Drew and Lindsay's research prowess for our continuing students, the students who are already enrolled. Their questions don't end on the first day of classes once fall semester began. And so we've been running another RCT to see what is the impact upon this tool upon our continuing students, and across the board we've seen really encouraging results there as well, especially in the space that Lindsay was just talking about. In the areas of students completing technical tasks like removing holds from their accounts, resolving balances that they owe the university, coming to see advisors in timely fashion. We're seeing in some cases 20 and 30% better response rates from the students on the chatbot than from the control group.
And Lindsay, do you want to talk a little bit about what questions you want to be asking going forward?
Absolutely. So, you know, I think that the studies that we've done so far have been an important sort of proof point on the fact that these kinds of tools can be useful. I see the sort of problem of summer melt as a fairly linear problem. We can really clearly map out the tasks that students need to handle in that summer in order to matriculate on time. And as Tim and many others in the college success space could testify, thinking about the ways in which we need to better support students to be successful once they've actually matriculated, that's a much bigger and messier problem. So I'm very excited to be in the space of truly testing through RCTs where and how these kinds of tools can be useful in better supporting students or giving institutions a tool to better support their students in order to be successful once they have matriculated.
Thank you. Great. So folks, I promised our panelists that I wouldn't put them on the spot with too many specifics because one of the principles about doing research is being humble, and you don't want to go forward too soon while you're still learning. You want to tell people what you've learned once you're confident that you've got your ducks in a row. But the principle behind this webinar series is that any empirical educator project sponsor, which AdmitHub is, can come forward with another demonstration of another contribution of knowledge at any time. And we'll talk about it again. And as you've heard, there's quite a bit of ongoing work. And so you can expect to hear more from this crew in the future here, and I'm sure elsewhere. Just a brief larger programming note, this will go up on the web on a YouTube channel. I'll make sure it's known in eLiterate. My dog agrees. And we're going to take a brief hiatus for the winter break after this fantastic inaugural session, but we'll have a schedule up soon with some more standard of proof webinars coming up starting in late January. In the meantime, remember, randomized controlled trials, not that hard. So thank you all. Thanks to my wonderful panelists. Thanks to a fantastic audience. And you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.